C60 olive oil is a popular choice for people wanting to activate their full potential. Improved sleep, faster recovery and more energy are just a few of the amazing comments received from our customers who take a spoonful a day. Make C60 oil a part of your daily routine and see what it can do for you. Activate your potential today at thec60company.com.
Robert Mueller, Russiagate and all that stuff. He was actually appointed head of the FBI 2 weeks before 9/11, right? Which I feel it in me water wasn't a coincidence. Anyway, he actually said, as head of the FBI, that there was not enough evidence for the 19 hijackers to being responsible to put it in a court of law. And that there wasn't enough evidence for bin Laden, right? And when I started investigating 9/11, which was basically from the day, one of the people I was in correspondence with for a book called Alice in Wonderland of the World Trade Center Disaster, came out in 2002, was a guy, the strange name of Rex Toome. Rex Toome. And we corresponded a bit when I was asking questions because he was a spokesman for the FBI. And someone else, more recently, a few years ago now, asked Rex Toome on behalf of the FBI why on their page about bin Laden, most wanted terrorist, was his list of crimes, or did his list of crimes not include 9/11? And Rex Toome, on behalf of the FBI, said because there's not enough hard evidence that he was involved. So, manipulators have known since Noah was a lad that, or is that anti-Semitic? I don't know. It was just an historical character that came into my mind. Let's say Plato was a lad then. That if you keep repeating a lie, eventually it becomes the truth. And this is how they work. And the media, of course, which is ultimately owned by this cult, if you go deep enough, they play the game of repeating untruths till they become an everyone knows that, mate. And so what they've done with 9/11 is just keep repeating untruths. And it just becomes, in the perception of not everybody, there's a lot of skepticism, but a lot of people, that's how it was. It wasn't like that at all.
So Russia invades Afghanistan. Russia leaves Afghanistan. The Mujahideen are fighting. They're backed by the CIA and the Americans. So the story is then, the plot is that bin Laden then turns his sights on the West and on the Americans, generating this hatred that culminates with 9/11. Mm-hmm. What's your response to that?
Well, it's a load of old crap. I mean, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor when Carter was president, he admitted to a French news magazine some years after he was with Carter that they had systematically manipulated the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan. And they, in his words, they wanted to give the Soviet Union their Vietnam. Because although people that invade Afghanistan cause a lot of death and destruction, they never win. It's basically a place where you can't win. You just keep on fighting, knowing that there's no end in sight. It's what's happening to the Americans now. So at that time, the government in Kabul, the capital, was a Soviet satellite government. So to draw the Soviet Union in, they wanted to put that Kabul government in danger of being overthrown. So they created the Mujahideen and funded them, and they wanted a front man who would be the kind of focal point of the resistance to the Soviets. And it was Osama bin Laden from this big-time Bush family-connected bin Laden family in Saudi Arabia. And he's the good guy then. Oh, that Osama bin Laden, he's lovely, he is. He's fighting the Soviets. He believes in democracy. Comes from Saudi Arabia. Anyway, and then the Soviets left, leaving a million dead Afghans behind. And then there was this morphing where Robin Cook, who at one point was foreign secretary in the Labour government, and to his eternal credit, resigned from office. He was in a different government position then, over the invasion of Iraq. He, after he'd stepped down as a minister, etc., he said, I think it was in The Guardian, that Al-Qaeda means the base or the database because the people that were the, if you like, members of Al-Qaeda were basically the same people on the CIA database of Mujahideen fighters who fought the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. So what happened was that the Mujahideen, oh, they're the good guys, they're fighting for freedom, suddenly became Al-Qaeda. Same people. Only this time, the scripts changed and the shows changed, the vaudevilles changed. Now they're the bad people, right? So now we have an excuse to do things because we're fighting the bad people that we wouldn't before. You know, if you want to go into a country and you don't have an excuse, then say there's a terrorist group there that's a threat to America or a threat to the world, and you're in. This is how it works. And of course, Al-Qaeda morphed into Al-Nusra and ISIS and all these people. It's basically the old technique of creating an enemy to justify the fight, creating an enemy to justify the war, justify going into countries you wouldn't have an excuse to do if you didn't create an enemy. And then, of course, that enemy was blamed for 9/11, which was a great way of obscuring who really did it.
Just going on a sidetrack there, we recently had the global announcement that the head of ISIS had been killed.
What, again?
How many times had he been killed by other countries?
Yeah, and why did they keep burying him at sea? They buried bin Laden at sea. You know, he's a Muslim from Saudi Arabia, not Jack Bloody Sparrow, is he? It's unbelievable. But, of course, why did they bury him at sea? So there's no evidence. It's so simple. Crazy, man.
So if Osama bin Laden was the hero fighting the Russians, then he becomes the enemy.
Yep.
How is it that the Bush family are able to maintain such tightness with his family? Isn't his family a massive construction?
That's right, in Saudi Arabia.
Could you expand on the bin Laden family and the relationship with Bush?
Well, see, this is what it comes down to. This, okay? You are involved in the Sabbatean Frankist cult, which goes into extreme Islam, it goes into Judaism, it goes into America, it goes into Britain, etc., etc. But outwardly, because this is the way the cult works, you appear to be a member and a supporter of a country or a culture or an organization. So then you hear people say, well, why would the bin Ladens do this? Why would they do that? Because they're thinking that what they appear to be is who they are. They're not. So if you have the Bush family connected to this cult, you have the bin Laden family connected to this cult, you have the Saudi royal family connected to this cult, you have those that control Israel connected to this cult, and so on and so forth around the world and around Europe, then suddenly you see how people that appear to be even in opposition to each other actually are working as one unit. But the other people around them, like the general Jewish population in Israel, the general Saudi population, will not know this. American population, they won't know this. They'll take everything on face value. This is a cult which has an agenda for human control on a global and technological level. Therefore, country borders are irrelevant. Why would an American do that? Why would a Saudi Arabian do that? Why would a Jew do that? Why would somebody from Islam do that? Hindu do that? Because they are those labels, but only in theory. And actually, they're all connected. And once you realize that there are those connections, then why someone would do something that's apparently not in the interests of what they appear to represent becomes totally clear. So, once you realize the existence of the cult, then if the Bin Ladens are members of the cult and the Bushes are members of the cult, well, they're gonna operate as one unit and support the goals and support the outcome. And so they were very close. Particularly Father Bush and the Bin Laden family. And I've talked to people that were been in mind control projects in America, in MK Ultra and elite aspects of the MK Ultra mind control project, who were close to George Bush, who were basically slaves to George Bush, mind control slaves to George Bush, and heard a hell of a lot going on. And they very openly that the Saudi government was the Saudi royal family was answering to Bush. Because the hierarchy, you see, the hierarchy of power, the hierarchy of control is not where you are in the hierarchy of your country. It's where you are in the hierarchy of the cult. So if Father Bush, God, not Boy Bush, Father Bush, was higher in the cult hierarchy than the Saudi royal family, then they take orders from him, even though they're the Saudi royal family and he's a one-time president. This is how it works. And it's this network that pulled off 9/11 because it was operating in America and it was operating in Israel, it was operating in Saudi Arabia. That's why most of the alleged hijackers were Saudi Arabian. And you've got families, and I do completely understand why, in America, who are seeking to challenge the Saudi royal family in court for their involvement in 9/11, but they're missing the cult. And I understand why. I mean, not many people know about it, but once you realize that the cult connections, then it wasn't just Saudi Arabia. It was those controlling Israel and Mossad and the Israeli intelligence community in general, Shin Bet, the domestic agency. It was those controlling the CIA. What I've been talking about all these years. Now is openly talked about. They call it the deep state. But the point is the cult controls the deep state. That's why the deep state does what it does.
This takes us into the book, The Trigger, and you write about the planes that were allowed to fly after everybody else had been grounded.
I'll tell you two, and it will be so relevant to what I've just said.
Yep.
2 planes were allowed to leave America after all planes except military were grounded. One flew members of the Bin Laden family, ironically out of Boston Logan, where the first 2 planes left, and another one was an El Al Israeli flight out of New York. Who was leaving? Members of the cult were leaving. That's why.
So in a criminal investigation, if your family member was suspected of, one of the worst tragedies in history, 9/11, you would immediately go to those family members and interview them to get information about his whereabouts and, the possibility of this happening. So the complete opposite was they were pushed out the country.
Yeah, get away. Oh, they weren't the only ones either.
All right, so we've talked about
It was a scam. It's a total scam. There's not one strand of the 9/11 official story that fits with another.
So we've brought the Bush family into this nicely, and I've researched the Bushes all the way back to the money laundering for the Nazis. But there are two other very interesting characters involved here, and you write about them extensively in the book. Perhaps if you could just give a bit of a summary about them and their roles. We've got Cheney and we've got Rumsfeld.
Well, why don't I give you a little sequence of events, which will bring them in. Here's a sequence. In 1979, a man called Issa Harel, who's known as the father of Israeli intelligence, did an interview with an American journalist in which he predicted that there would be an Arab attack on New York's biggest building. He had in mind the Empire State Building, but of course the biggest buildings on 9/11 were the Twin Towers. Also in 1979, Benjamin Netanyahu organized a conference in Jerusalem to call for a war on terrorism. Father Bush attended it. And for preemptive strikes against terrorist states before they did any terrorism. In 1984, Benjamin Netanyahu organized another one in America, and it was attended by the American government and military elite, calling for a war on terrorism. He wrote a book around the same time. In 1996, Benjamin Netanyahu was prime minister of Israel by 1996, and a group of ultra-Zionists, led by a guy called Richard Pearl, produced a document for Netanyahu called a clean break, securing the realm being Israel, which called for Saddam Hussein to be removed from Iraq, which called for Syria and Iran to be targeted, and said that the more inter-Arab conflict we can create, the better. A year later, 1997, an organization was created in America called the Project for the New American Century. One of its key members was Richard Pearl, who did the clean break. And the co-founders of the Project for the New American Century were William Crystal, ultra-Zionist, and Robert Kagan, ultra-Zionist. Kagan's wife, Victoria Nuland, was the State Department's head of Eurasian affairs, who oversaw the American coup in Ukraine. Everything connects. It's a very small world with this cult. So that started in 1997. In 1998, this same group wrote to President Clinton calling for Saddam Hussein to be overthrown in Iraq. We're starting to get the picture. In the year 2000, in September 2000, this Project for the New American Century, among whose members were Dick Cheney, who would be 9/11 de facto president, officially vice president, Donald Rumsfeld, who would be 9/11 defense secretary, Paul Wolfowitz, who would be his deputy, but the real power in the Pentagon, Dov Zakheim, who would control ultra-Zionist, who would control the whole of the Pentagon budget at the time of 9/11. And on September the 10th, the day before the attacks, the Pentagon announced that they'd lost $2.3 trillion. It had just gone missing, right? Well, I've got an idea what some of it was spent on, chaps. But anyway, and of course, they announced it on September the 10th, and not many people heard about it because something happened the next day, which these people knew was going to happen, of course. That's why they did it on the 10th. And so this is what you had, this group of people. Also among the project for the New American Century was Richard Pearl, Netanyahu's mate, who wrote Clean Break, and John Bolton, who's been calling until he got removed by Trump, all along has been calling for regime change in a series of Arab countries. He's never seen a country he didn't want to bomb, John Bolton. So that document that this Project for the American Century produced in September 2000 called for a series of countries to be regime changed using American troops. And basically, the foundation of it was what was in the Clean Break, securing the realm of Israel. So instead of using Israeli troops, they wanted to use American troops to do what benefited Israel, what benefited the cult, basically. And so they wanted regime change in September 2000 in Iraq, Libya, Iran, Lebanon, and other countries, including North Korea, leading eventually to regime change in China. And that was what they wanted. They called in this document, and it was an ultra-Zionist organization, the Project for the New American Century. They called for American troops to fight and decisively win multiple theater wars in these countries to regime change. But they also said in this document, September 2000, that this, what they called in the quote, process of transformation, regime change, would necessarily be slow because they wouldn't have the support to do it, quote, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. 1 year to the month after that document was published, 9 months after these people came to power with Bush, America had what Bush called at the time the Pearl Harbor of the 21st century, 9/11. And as a result of that, those attacks, these countries have been ticked off ever since in what was called, quoting Netanyahu back in the 70s and 80s, a war on terror. According to the New York Times, I'm taking through a timeline here. According to the New York Times, on September the 19th and 20th, 2001, immediately after the attacks, this same group of people I'm talking about, operating under the defense, a defense organization out of the Pentagon, decided that Saddam Hussein had to be removed from Iraq. So you're seeing the progression here. Then we have General Wesley Clark, who was a former Supreme Commander of NATO, who went on an kind of alternative internet TV program called Democracy Now! In 2007, and described his experience immediately after 9/11. He said he went to the Pentagon, he met Rumsfeld, he met Wolfowitz, and then went down and met a general friend of his in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the uniform level of the Pentagon hierarchy. And this general, he said, told him days after 9/11 they were going to invade Iraq. Well, that kind of fits because that's where we've been leading. And you can see where the Iraq thing came from now. His question was, why are we going to invade Iraq? Had everything to do with 9/11? They said, well, we don't think so, but we're going to invade Iraq. It's coming from upstairs. So Clark goes away, comes back a few weeks later, by which time America's in Afghanistan. And by the way, within an hour or so of the attacks, Ehud Barak, brackets, friend of Jeffrey Epstein, who was the Prime Minister of Israel into the early months of 2001, he went on the BBC immediately after the attacks and pointed the finger for them at Osama bin Laden and talked about an invasion of Afghanistan, right? This is a guy who was also a massive figure in Israeli intelligence. So they're in Afghanistan by now. And he says he went back, Clark. He went back, and he met his general friend again, who said, well, he said to him, why haven't we invaded Iraq? I thought we were going to invade Iraq. He said, it's worse than that, sir, He said, we just had this from upstairs. And he pulled up a piece of paper, Clark said, and he said, we're going to invade 7 countries in 5 years. And the countries he named were all from the Project the New American Century document in September 2000. Included Syria, and which was also on the Project the New American Century document, Assad, getting rid of him, Libya, Syria, all of them, they were all there, Iran, etc. And so you see the cult's influence in the sense that at the time of 9/11, you had Bush, Republican, in the White House, and you had Blair, Labour, it says here, in Downing Street, and they invade Afghanistan, and then they invade Iraq. Oh, Benjamin, you got it at last after all this time, right? On a lie, of course. And people say, why did they lie about weapons of mass destruction? Because it's on the list and they don't have an excuse, so they made one up to tick it off the list. It is simple when you realize how it works. But then Blair goes and Bush goes. And in comes Bush's opponent, Obama, Democrat, and in comes Blair's opponent, Cameron, Conservative. And they pick off Libya and then start the process of the catastrophe of a fake civil war orchestrated by the same forces we've talked about, the paid mercenary terrorists, etc., in Syria. And then they go. And in comes the maverick Trump. And I put it on the internet when he came to power, key word of Trump's administration, Iran. And of course, they've been targeting Iran vehemently and actually had planes in the air to attack them at one point a few weeks ago before Trump pulled it back overwhelmingly, it seems to me, from the circumstances of the time, because it had been pointed out to him the consequences electorally of him invading Iran, given that he got to power to a massive extent by saying he was going to stop all that nonsense, right? Anyway, but now they're doing it with sanctions and trying to create unrest and protests that turn into people regime change. So here you have a situation where this ultra-Zionist, I say cult, organization names the countries, says we need a Pearl Harbor to justify it. Pearl Harbor happens. People that called for Pearl Harbor and regime change come to power, and regime change. I mean, hello? I mean, anyone home? So then you think, okay, so who oversaw the entire investigation of 9/11? A guy called Michael Chertoff, ultra Zionist, who was appointed in 2001, before 9/11, as the head of the criminal division of the Justice Department, which oversaw the investigation. And so Michael Chertoff oversaw the investigation. He also wrote the Patriot Act, which clearly had been written before 9/11, which was then brought out immediately afterwards to take away basic freedoms in America, justified by protecting the public against terrorism, and then becomes head of Homeland Security to impose and enforce the Patriot Act that he'd written. How many people know this? That in 2001, 200 Israelis were arrested in America for being part of a spy ring. 140 were arrested before 9/11, and 60 were arrested afterwards. Many of them were posing as art students when they clearly weren't. They gave a university in Israel where they were doing their art. That university turned out not to exist. And there were a number of centers that they worked out of, and all this came out through a leaked document from the Drug Enforcement Administration. Without that, it wouldn't have come out. But the key place these documents said the Israeli spy ring was based was a place called Hollywood in Florida, not far from Miami, which was where 15 of the 19 alleged hijackers operated out of, including Mohammed Attar. And they were even where these art students were and where Mohammed Attar was extremely close. And there were other areas in New Jersey that they operated, these art students and other members of this ring, where these alleged hijackers also operated. It was a remarkable coincidence.
Does this include the dancing Israelis?
Yeah, I'm coming to them, yeah. So what happened was that they were questioned by the FBI, etc. And then along came Michael Chertoff, ultra-Zionist, head of the criminal division of the Justice Department. He let them go. All this came out, not just through those documents, but through a series of reports, I think there were 4 of them, by a Fox News reporter called Carl Cameron. Excellent reports, where he just revealed all this stuff. Of course, they were off the Fox website very quickly, never to be seen again, but some people downloaded them. You can still see them if you work to find them. And then you mentioned, yes, the dancing Israelis. This was also a part of this. On 9/11, a woman was looking out of her apartment, looking across the river to the Twin Towers. The first tower, the North Tower, had just been hit. And she saw these, what she described as Middle East-looking men. And of course, the immediate reaction were they're Arabs. They weren't. They were Israelis. And they were with a white van filming the tower burning. Only one at that time. And other witnesses swear they were there before the first tower was hit. And they were whooping and high-fiving, and this is where the term dancing Israelis came from. And they clearly had prior knowledge of the attack. And 2 of them were known to the FBI, it turned out, as Mossad operatives, right? So she reports them to the police, and eventually they get picked up. They're held for 71 days. It turns out that they were connected to a company in New Jersey called Urban Moving Systems, which was headed by a guy called Dominic Suter. Dominic Suter, not surprisingly, when they investigated this, was questioned by the FBI and told that they would be back for a second interview. Well, they weren't, because he was on a plane to Israel, and that was it. Although I've heard, I've just updated the book for the second print run, I now hear that years later he came back to America and no one said anything. He worked and worked and worked. No problem whatsoever, right? So you see in the book the background to it. Now the FBI and police were absolutely sure that they were connected to the event. How would you know otherwise? This Urban Moving Systems was just a front. Just after 9/11, everything shut down. Everyone left, ran. Just a front. Box cutters, boxes, and all this stuff. And they were held by the FBI for 71 days. And then Michael Chertoff, ultra-Zionist, head of the criminal division of the Justice Department, let him go without charging them for anything to do with 9/11. And some of the people supporting that included a well-known ultra-Zionist politician called Chuck Schumer, and a very well-known ultra-Zionist lawyer, Alan Dershowitz, who, of course, is was a close friend and associate of Jeffrey Epstein. And so you had this clear Israeli ring operating in the same areas as the alleged hijackers were operating, who were just let go. You had these 5 Israelis who clearly had prior knowledge of the attacks, 2 of them who were known Mossad agents, and they're let go. And wherever you look with 9/11, the same theme occurs. Who bought the lease to the Twin Towers weeks before 9/11? Larry Silverstein, ultra-Zionist, and Frank Lowy, ultra-Zionist. Silverstein was such a close friend of Benjamin Netanyahu. This has been reported by the Israeli press as well as the alternative, that he and Netanyahu used to have a telephone chat every Sunday. What happened is that the Twin Towers were a bit of a white elephant, really. They were under-occupied and they were getting out of date, and they weren't a good buy. But Silverstein and Lowy, dominated by Silverstein, bought the Twin Towers and immediately significantly increased the insurance in the event of a terrorist attack. This meant that for a personal investment in the lease of $14 million, Silverstein and co. were paid out in insurance $4.56
Holy shit.
billion.
Wow.
And the person who did the deal for the insurance was a guy called Morris Greenberg, ultra-Zionist, friend of Henry Kissinger, who was from the AIG insurance giant. And being very canny, or maybe he was a prophet, who knows, he sold the insurance on immediately to about 24 other companies who took the hit. Right. Now, before I continue that thread, another one. Israeli intelligence was trying to get control of security at the Twin Towers since at least 1987. They first applied for it through a company called Atwell Security that was a subsidiary of the Eisenberg group of a guy called Shaul Eisenberg, who was a massive Israeli intelligence operative, ran Zim Shipping. Zim Shipping, by the way, left the World Trade Center a week before the 9/11 and broke its lease to do so. Another coincidence, nothing to worry about. And he was involved in the terror groups like Irgun that bombed and terrorized Israel into existence in 1948. So Atwell Security was run by Israeli intelligence agents who worked with Issa Harel, the guy who predicted that New York's biggest building would be attacked by Arabs. He made the prediction in 1979. So they would have had control of security of the Twin Towers then. Maybe 9/11 would have happened earlier, who knows? But there was a problem. The man who signed the contract for Atwell Security gave the name Avram Bendor. It turned out pretty soon afterwards that his real name was different. It was Avram Shalom. former major executive, if you like, in Israeli intelligence, domestic intelligence, who had to stand down for ordering that two Palestinians had their heads smashed in with stones, and had to stand down as a result. When all this came out, Atwell lost the contract. So we move on to 1993. Only a few years after 1987, they're still trying to get hold of that security for some reason. And we had the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, which involved an Israeli Mossad agent whose name was on the hire contract of a hire truck that was involved. And other people were blamed for it. As a result of that bombing, the completely ultra-Zionist controlled New York and New Jersey Port Authority who'd given the contract to Atwell originally in 1987. They decided, as a result of the bombing, that security at the Twin Towers had to be improved. And so they hired an ultra-Zionist company called Kroll Inc. to oversee the security, which they did right up to 2001 and the attacks. Also in 1993, a man called Morris Greenberg bought into Kroll Inc. This is the guy that provided the insurance to Silverstein and to Lowy, and was this close friend of Henry Kissinger. So we move on to Silverstein and the control of that, the lease, the buying of the lease. That was sold by the ultra-Zionist controlled guy at the time called Louis Eisenberg, a different Eisenberg, Louis Eisenberg, and who was a friend of Netanyahu. He sold it from the New York and New Jersey Port Authority into private hands for the first time. And this followed the recommendation of a guy called Ronald Lauder of the Esther Lauder family, ultra-Zionist, eventually became head of the World Jewish Congress, and not only a friend, but a funder of Benjamin Netanyahu. And he headed two organizations in New York that were given the task of deciding what should be privatized and what shouldn't. And they recommended that the Twin Towers should be privatized, and that's when Silverstein and Lowy got the contract. And so everywhere you look, in the run-up to 9/11, there were ultra-Zionists involved everywhere. The person who was Rudolph Giuliani, the mayor of New York at the time, head of emergency management, and that emergency management operation was actually in Building 7, also owned by Silverstein. He owned that before the Twin Towers. He was an ultra-Zionist as well, everywhere you look. And then you look afterwards. One of the things that would tell you why the Twin Towers fell was to have experts look over the rubble, and they'd establish why they came down. People talked about explosions just before they came down, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever happened, they would have found out. But there was this rush using a Zionist transportation company to get the rubble from ground zero into Zionist-owned scrap yards in New Jersey, where the steel, etc., was cut up around the clock and put on ships to Asia for smelting to become someone's fridge. And there is a quote in the book, which was in the New York Times, And it described the fast. Now, let's just remember here that 3,000 people were killed that day, and many thousands more of their loved ones will have had their lives decimated ever since, and they'll never fully recover. And we had no investigation into why those towers came down, and instead, the debris that could have answered those questions was taken to these scrap yards in New Jersey to be cut up as fast as possible and shipped out to Asia for smelting. This New York Times article by someone who, to be fair, even though it was the New York Times, this one actual writer was obviously seriously pissed off by what he saw. And he describes in there this scene, given that background. At one of the scrap yards, the rubble was piled up. And by the way, it's been admitted by the authorities that some body parts, body flesh, ended up filling potholes in New York roads. Story I tell in the book as well. I'm not kidding you. These are psychopaths. They don't give a shit. Anyway, this scene described by the New York Times, the piles of rubble from being brought over to from 9/11, the site of 9/11, the Twin Towers. And by the way, the company that transported them, the Zionist company that transported them, said that it was done like a military operation, moving the debris, because they were tracked. The lorries were tracked by GPS, so they always know where they were because of the sensitive material. What they did when it got the other end is dump the bloody stuff. And one driver, which the company admitted, took half an hour longer for lunch than he should have done on his journey, sacked him because they had to get from A to B without anyone having any access to it. So this New York Times article, you pile of rubble, you've got building experts trying to work out why the towers fell, who should have been doing it on site. And this article describes how they're waiting there. A big grabber comes down, grabs some stuff, moves it across. And while it's moving across, these building experts are running into the rubble, trying to find anything that's relevant, and then turning and running back before it returns. This is the scale of scam that went on, this callous psychopathy that has prevented the true story of 9/11 coming to light, and people being terrified of telling the story because of consequences for them. Well, look at me. I don't give a shit. I care about the truth, and the truth needs to come out, and at last it bloody well is. So, then we look at some other aspects of this. The last thing that the cabal wanted was this to come to court where the evidence could be put on public display. Their big problem was families, with just under 100 of them, that didn't take the compensation, which came with the proviso, you take the money, but you agree not to go to court. Nearly 100 families said, no, we're not having it. The compensation fund, pressurizing the families to take it and shut up and not go to court, was overseen by an ultra-Zionist called Kenneth Feinberg, who was also the person after 2008 that decided about executive compensation after the crash of 9/11 in all the bailouts. The crash of 2008, in all the bailouts. Now, these nearly 100 families that didn't accept that, they wanted their day in court. They wanted to have some evidence publicly displayed. They, the civil litigation group, were overseen by Judge Alvin Hellerstein ultra-Zionist, whose son in Israel represented a law firm that represented the parent company of a Israeli intelligence agents security company called ICTS that ran security at Boston Logan Airport and at Newark, New Jersey. The company, by the way, that also ran security. These are intelligence agencies from the Israeli military intelligence, Mossad, Shin Bet, etc., the domestic intelligence agency. They also oversaw security at Paris airport when the shoe bomber got on. They oversaw the security at Schiphol, Amsterdam, when the underwear bomber got on. And as a result of the underwear bomber, Michael Chertoff, who was then in private, business, he went around the television stations selling full-body scanners to make sure another underpant bomber couldn't get on, and that's why, to this day, people go through full-body scanners at airports because of Michael Chertoff, head of the criminal division of the Justice Department at the time of 9/11, writer of the Patriot Act, head of Homeland Security, et cetera, that let all those Israelis go. Yes, ICTS was also running security at the Belgian airport when the bomb went off. I think it was 2016, and a lot of people died. So hire them, I would. And anyway, Alvin Hellerstein ran what even the mainstream media called a war of attrition to block the families getting to court. And the last one, eventually, because of a decision by Hellerstein, they pulled out in 2010. So none of the families got to court. His associates overseeing that civil litigation group of families were also ultra-Zionists. Alvin Hellerstein was also the judge that oversaw the litigation between Larry Silverstein and the airlines that ended in Silverstein getting a payout on top of the 4.56 billion of another 10 million.
Jesus.
By the way, the judge that oversaw the Silverstein v. the insurance company's litigation that led to the 4.56 billion was Michael McCasey, ultra-Zionist, who eventually became Attorney General of the United States. Then we come to this. The other problem they had, apart from the families getting to court, the other problem they had was, well, there's got to be some kind of investigation, right? We've got to have an investigation. I mean, it's the biggest terror attack in American history. 3,000 people dead. We've got to have an investigation. Well, no, if you remember, Dick Cheney, Project the New American Century, and George Bush, puppet president, resisted for ages any investigation into this attack. Why? They don't want an investigation. The truth might come out. So eventually, public pressure forces them into accepting some kind of investigation. It's called the 9/11 Commission. The person they named to head it first, Henry Kissinger. More ultra-Zionist than ultra-Zionism itself, right? So, of course, that's so ludicrous, and it was demanded that he reveal his clients in his company, Kissinger Associates, which would have, as I've said in the book, it wouldn't have just opened a can of worms. That it would have launched it to Mars, right? So now he had to stand down. So they bring another guy in, ultra-Zionist Philip Zelikow, who wrote an article in one of these influential magazines in 1998, warning America of a new Pearl Harbor and a terrorist attack on American targets. Anyway, Philip Zelikow, Bush insider, very close friend of Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State in the Bush administration, and they wrote a book together, actually. And he oversaw the 9/11 Commission, which was a joke of a non-investigation. And I go into it in the book. Building 7 was a big Achilles heel. Building 7 was owned by Silverstein before the Twin Towers. And not a lot of people, there was even a judge I quote in the book. There was a 9/11 connected case, sometime later. And the subject in the case or the evidence of Building 7 came up. And this judge says, Building 7, what's that? Most people don't realize 3 buildings fell, not 2. And Building 7, 47 stories, also known as the Salomon Building, fell about 5:20 in the evening. In fact, about 26 minutes earlier, the BBC had a reporter reporting live saying that Building 7 had fallen, and it was still standing behind her. Right. So obviously, they've got the press release out of sync here. So it fell, and it fell with the most obvious, clear, controlled demolition you'll ever see. Where they put explosives in different parts of a building, and you see it with stadiums and big skyscrapers, and the charges go off, and they're so perfectly placed that it falls on its own footprint instead of toppling over. Exactly what, if anyone's new to this, go to YouTube, put Building 7 collapse in, and you'll see the most blatant controlled demolition you've ever seen. In fact, the explanation of the buildings coming down is so utterly ridiculous that there's an organization, as there are many others over different subject areas of 9/11, called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, which are experts in their field, lots of them now, who've come together to say the explanations of the buildings falling is insane, right? But not to the 9/11 Commission. What happened was that the building fell. It was obviously a controlled demolition. Controlled demolition experts have looked at it and have said, what brought the building down? Controlled demolition. There was one guy, he's a Dutch expert. He didn't even know three buildings had fallen. And a TV crew went along and just played him the building falling and said, what do you think caused that? He said, well, it's controlled demolition. It's obvious. He didn't even know it had anything to do with 9/11. Anyway, so they've got a problem. How do you explain 47 stories and these massive, massive steel pillars collapsing simultaneously on their own footprint, which meant every single pillar had to give way at the same time? Ludicrous. So what can we do? Well, they left the investigation into this is not the 9/11 Commission. The government agency investigating the collapse of Building 7 kind of panned out their investigation. And eventually they came out. And there was a fire in Building 7. No plane hit it. No plane came near it, but there was a fire. It was not a big fire, but just a fire. Certainly not enough to bring a building like that down. In fact, according to the official story, that fire did bring it down, which made it, still to this day, the only steel-structured building ever to fall just because of fire. Of course, it didn't. It was controlled demolition. Anyway, the government agency then comes out and holds this press conference and announces what brought down a 47-story massive steel-framed building. An office furnishings fire. We're back to Prince Andrew, you see. When you're lying and you can't therefore tell the truth of what happened, it was controlled demolition, then you have to make something up, and it's usually ludicrous.